Hi everyone, and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm your host, Anthony Pastori. Thanks for joining us. A circular economy is defined as one that reuses materials and repurposes waste to give something a second life. It sounds simple enough, but not so fast there. We need to first understand the drivers behind it, and of course some of the challenges that lie ahead with it. So I'm going to be joined right now by Michelle Liberty, Thematic Investing Associate with the Chief Investment Office. Michelle, big report here on the circular economy. It was a really interesting report to read through. So I know we're going to give our audience a little bit of the highlights here. So good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. Welcome back. We love having you here. Why don't we get into the details and have you start off by describing what a circular economy is versus what we probably know more as a standard linear economy.
Yep, sure. So if you think about a linear economy, it is one where a good is made, you use it, and then you dispose of it. Where a circular economy, as you mentioned in your introduction here, is one where a good is made, it's used, it is then recycled and repurposed for a second life, and it's used again. And it's not exactly a new concept, right? We've had thrifting, even something like waste to energy has been around for years and years. But we are seeing a renewed focus on this concept, just as resource scarcities, for one, have really proven the damage that they can have on the economy. This year specifically with energy. So what we actually did was put our report around the 3 R's, so reduce, reuse, recycle, and we actually put an investment angle around each of those R's.
Terrific. So why don't you give us a little bit of maybe some of the key drivers within the circular economy? Because as you mentioned, those 3 R's, I know we're going to get into that a little bit more, but what are the drivers here?
Sure. So some of the same drivers of our longer term investment series in general still apply here. So something like demographics and population growth, that's not too hard to see the connection there. Put very simply, there's more people now using more things, and as a result, we have more waste to tackle. But when you think about something like resale, so kind of honing in on one piece of the report here, something like textile waste has really grown over the last decade or so because we've seen really great use of economies of scale. We've had access to cheaper clothing, more accessible clothing, and that's not always a bad thing. But as a result of that, we've seen volumes really grow, and recycling just has not kept pace. So it's actually estimated that every single second, a garbage truck full of textiles goes to landfill or is incinerated. And it's costly too. So New York City alone spends about $20 million a year just collecting and landfilling textiles.
Wow.
So it's a huge cost, and it's also just something that, like I said, just hasn't been addressed in terms of what we're going to do with all of this waste as volumes have grown so significantly over the last decade or so.
God, that's incredible. It's not something I think that the average person will think about on a daily basis, is what happens to all the textiles for extra things that aren't being used to create anything new in the first place, or anything that's thrown away, old clothes, anything that has, made out of those kinds of materials. $20 million, it's incredible. So let's get into those 3 R's. And they're ones that I think many people out there watching this have heard thousands of times. Reduce, reuse, recycle. So how do these, I guess, really form an investment standpoint within the thematic universe itself?
Sure. So before I get to each of the 3 R's, just to your last point on the catalyst, because that's something that we thought about when we were making those 3 chapters, we really have to think about the regulatory piece, because outside of just the growth in waste, we've also seen a new focus on regulatory restrictions that are going to change the way that companies have to deal with this type of waste. So outside of just pure growth, that's been a key component as well. And then breaking that down into the 3 R's, we actually switched the order up in our report a little bit, and we started with recycle, because of course, in order to have a circular economy, economy, you have to collect something before you can reuse it.
Right.
And from an investment perspective, what's interesting about the recycle piece is that some of the U.S. large recycling companies actually have a bit of pricing power just given their pretty high market share as well as stable earnings. So from a tactical perspective, that's interesting right now. But then reduce, we focus on plastics here and the innovation that's happening there, whether it's chemical recycling or plastics that are made from non-virgin plastic materials or non-fossil fuel feedstock. And then finally, reuse, just spending a little bit more time on this one. We've seen a number of companies IPO recently in this space. And again, I think the regulatory piece is big here, because the EU waste directive, for just one example, there's a few, by 2025, you'll need to set textile waste separate from other waste. But then when that's collected, it's going to be illegal to burn it or to landfill it. So that's going to change the way that we use textile waste.
So that goes into really reusing that waste.
Right, so something has to be done with it.
Right.
And I think that can incentivize circular concepts. And we've actually seen more recently, bigger brands start to partner with some of these resellers. And I think that's significant because it's a big change in tone from what we've seen in the past. Because in the past, luxury brands specifically, they didn't want to tarnish their brand with excess inventory. So they would actually destroy it or burn excess inventory. And they're not going to be able to do that anymore.
Wow.
So we've seen, again, this kind of rise in partnerships with these resellers. And that's a pretty significant change from what we've seen before.
I expect we'll also see some really ingenious uses for those leftover textiles. People get very creative when they have to be, and when they're forced to come up with a plan for something that changes how they've dealt with it in the past. Like you said, those luxury brands can't just throw it away, burn it, whatever they've done in the past. They've got to figure out a really interesting way to reuse it. And interestingly, in the report that where you're talking about the circular economy, it talks about how the secondhand market in the U.S. is expected to double by 2026. I'm sure this has something to do with it, where we're not going to be able to just burn textiles. But that's a really fascinating thought to think about, by 2026, how it's going to double the secondhand market. It's incredible. Yeah,
we have seen a shift in tone too from the consumer, and that's another catalyst, to your point earlier. And the consumer, like I said, thrifting's been around for a while, but it used to have a bit of a stigma around it. Whereas now the consumer sees it, almost as something that is like bragging rights. They say, "Oh, I've reused something," or they can feel good about it from a green perspective. So that's really, again, just renewed focus on this area. And I think what's also interesting, outside of the environmental piece, is that we reviewed a number of surveys, and consumers indicated they also are open to secondhand goods shopping because it's more affordable. So given this inflationary backdrop that we're seeing, that's interesting as well.
Yeah, it certainly is. And is always very interesting and fun ways you see on various social media platforms where people are reusing things like plastics or textiles to make them into something that has sustainability, that it's lasts forever. They make flower pots, or they'll make things for their kids in school, like using plastic straws to make something else. So it's really clever how people are taking that waste that we used to just throw and end up in the oceans, which you and I have talked about many times, and use it for something that can be used to beautify a home or even a garden or something like that. So it's really cool. But obviously, everything comes with risk. Everything comes with challenges. So what would you say are some of the key challenges here?
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to take a look at the report, because each section does have its own unique risks, whether it's recycling or plastic specifically. But focusing on that resale piece, I think number one, the industry is incredibly competitive. So we have some larger incumbents that are at risk of losing market share to new competitors, but we also have a lot of smaller companies that are trying to battle their way and gain some market share. So we should see some industry consolidation. We do think that that's going to be key in terms of reaching profitability, because many of these newly IPO'd companies are not profitable. So the industry is incredibly competitive. That's something that we need to watch before it can truly become very profitable. But the other thing that I would mention are authenticity and again, just the consumer if that trend changes. So
Right.
if all of a sudden secondhand isn't cool anymore, that of course will change the thesis pretty dramatically. But authenticity is very important. So any company that sells luxury goods is going to need to be able to authenticate it, because if they can't, then the consumer could lose confidence and they could lose their reputation. But I think that's also an interesting opportunity as well, because if you have a competitive advantage there, that might help you set yourself apart. Or for some of the third-party authenticators, they might have an opportunity to step in and aid the market here. So
yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I know one that we could talk about quite a bit, because the report itself, which for those of you who are interested, it's called the circular economy. It's one of the longer-term investment themes from the Chief Investment Office. It goes into a lot more detail. There's some really fascinating charts in there about the 3 Rs, about the circular economy itself. So I'm sure we're going to be focusing on this for the long term, as the title says. So Michelle, always good to have you here, and thanks for giving us a little bit of a taste into the circular economy. Good to see you.
thanks, Anthony.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see what's going to happen with all these leftover textiles and how companies are going to manage that. That's going to be a really interesting journey to watch.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Michelle. And for more information and access to that report, again, it's called Circular Economy, a longer-term investment theme from the Chief Investment Office. You can take a look at our website, ubs.com/views. It's up there right now, and plus a lot of other reports. Plus, there's a lot of information on social media as well: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Plus, as a reminder, all of our past UBS Trending episodes are available on demand. If you have any questions about how anything we spoke about today impacts your own portfolio, make sure to speak with your financial advisor. In the meantime, I'm Anthony Pastore. Have a great day, everybody, and remember to keep your eyes on what's trending. We will see you soon.